Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Pokemon Go, check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we are going to be doing a deck spotlight of Arceus Inteleon, looking towards the World Championships in London 2022. Very powerful archetype that's been around since the release of Arceus V-Star. Let's jump into it, first of all, with the general strategy, and that is that Arceus V-Star is a really unfair card. It is just very overstated for a 2-prize Pokemon. You have 280 raw hit points that you can even Big Charm your way up to 310. You have Trinity Nova, as well as Trinity Charge on the regular V, both allowing you to attach additional energies onto your V Pokemon, which is a fantastic way to chain your attackers and allow you to have access to the supporter Sharon's Care, which is only usable on colourless types. But because we attach so many energies from our deck naturally via the Trinity Nova attack, we're able to pick up damaged Arceus, essentially removing a turn of damage from the opponent if they've not been able to reach all the way up to 310 damage, because we can simply replay Arceus V-Star, re-bench things, and use Trinity Nova all over again to establish even more energy out of our deck. So Trinity Nova, although it only deals, in air quotes, 200 damage, you're oftentimes looking to 2-hit KO opposing 2 and 3 prize Pokemon. Because we have the Sharon's Care supporter at our side, we can gain a lot of additional turns out of the opponent if they're not able to use Boss's Orders on key turns, or if they just don't have a high enough damage threshold. You can really take advantage of that. I've already talked about how good Arceus is before even mentioning the Starbirth V-Star power, making this deck one of the most consistent decks in the game, because you can use once per game, searching your deck for 2 cards and put them directly into your hand. This can allow all sorts of combinations. For the most part, this helps us establish cards like Double Turbo Energy to get our Trinity Nova working as quickly as turn 2. It can also get all sorts of other combinations, backup attackers for us, big charms, additional disruption pieces like Path to the Peak can be a big one as well. So you can really make all sorts of combinations happen with that Starbirth ability. From there, we have the Inteleon as the backup, allowing us to have a lot more coverage naturally in the deck. It means that we have a 1-prize attacking Pokemon to help deal with Miltank naturally within our list, which is fantastic. You don't have to add in any additional spaces to already have an answer, in air quotes. And it also means that beyond that Starbirth ability, we have Shady Dealings then to sort of take the reins and allow us to get some crucial pieces out of the deck when required. It can be Disruption from Roxanne or Sharon's Care. It can be Boss's Orders for aggressive prize cards. It can be all sorts of things just directly coming out of the deck thanks to the Inteleon engine to help us see us through to that mid and late game when we no longer have that Starbirth available. Inteleon also attacks for water energy, and it opens up us to be able to use Melanie, which is a fantastic way to power up Arceus potentially all in one turn, which means you don't even need to get a turn 1 energy drop onto an Arceus V, as long as you can somehow find a way to discard a water energy, Melanie, and use a double turbo all in one turn to get an Arceus out of nowhere. This is a fantastic option for the deck as well. Let's now talk about a matchup spread here for some of the more popular decks in format. This is based on the Trainer Hill data that we've had so far for almost the entire month of July here. So we have a pretty good number of games behind this, seeing as though Arceus Inteleon is one of the more popular decks online in these events. So I do believe this data to be pretty accurate. For the most part, 1-prize matchup seems to be the most favourable ones you can see here, and that's mostly because these decks naturally don't have high enough damage caps to deal with Arceus in one hit very easily for the most part, at least until you get into other late game stages. You'll notice Regigigas is one of the most favourable ones here, and that could be good or bad depending on whether or not you choose to play a Dunsparce in your deck list. I do think the matchup would sink down the list a little bit if you decide to cut Dunsparce. But that being said, every other matchup seems pretty comfortable for the Arceus Inteleon player, because it just feeds into their strategy of using Sharon's Care to undo a ton of damage. Dropping down to the favourable matchups, it looks like you're pretty strong into other Arceus decks, simply because you have more tutoring throughout the entire game. to take advantage of, once again, that Sharon's Care, where Arceus Duraludon is capped at that lower threshold, as is Arceus Flying Pikachu. Typically, the Arceus Inteleon player will have as much healing and even more access to these cards thanks to Shady Dealings than these other two Arceus partners, making it slightly favourable for the Inteleon player. Ice Rider is a bit of a surprising one, but the numbers are showing that Arceus is coming out on top more often than not. Ice Rider, of course, has a high damage threshold, which does make it dangerous against Arceus, but I think the combination of Big Charm really is one here that's worth noting, where Ice Rider has a lot more difficult of a time just getting into the game, being forced into Melanie turn after turn, locks it into sorts of certain lines of play, I guess you could say, and also requires Choice Belt as well as Tool Scrapper all in one go to achieve one-hit KOs. So sometimes, even despite the high damage output of the Ice Rider, it can still be defended by the Arceus player. And if all else fails, they always have a Roxanne to fall back on and can make it difficult for the Ice Rider to close out the game because they require Melanie and, again, additional combo pieces. So I think it's really just an out-consistency situation, which puts it slightly ahead of Ice Rider in the stats right now. It also seems to be doing pretty well into the Turbo variants, the Turbo Dialga, certainly a scary archetype, as is the Turbo Palkia, and it does seem like the Palkia Inteleon is a more difficult matchup for the Arceus Inteleon players as of right now. So just one to bear in mind there, where the Turbo build comes out swinging a lot more consistently fast, I would say, but doesn't really have that stopping power in that mid-game that you often see with the Inteleon build, where it can string together certain combinations much more easily via big Shady Dealings, rather than just cherry-picking with Mew here and there. And then finally, Inteleon Toolbox is slightly favoured. Inteleon Toolbox is kind of always changing, so this is a bit of a precarious one, as I do think the new Radiant Charizard is a big upgrade to the deck, and I think people are still finding their feet with Inteleon Toolbox, but it does seem to be a popular deck that I would prepare for Worlds. Right now, again, just having that 310 hit points sitting behind a Big Charm is a pretty good strategy against most one-prize decks, especially because you naturally play a couple copies of Marnie and Palpad to try and disrupt this Inteleon-only engine. Some of the even matchups, the Blissey Miltank is a bit of a close one. Naturally, you don't care too much about the Miltank side of things, although it can slow you down a little bit. It's mostly the pressure of a Blissey trying to heal up on you that you have to be a little bit concerned with, because as long as they can find lots of Hyper Potions, they can build big enough Blisseys that sort of renders your Sharon's Care useless in the late game, and it can just be an unstoppable wall taking a ton of prize cards. I think ideally the Blissey player is trying to deal with lots of Sobble and Drizzle in the opening stages, whilst they power up their Bliss, and it becomes more dangerous, because if they're just hitting into the Arceus player, or just the Arceus in the active position, you can already Sharon's Care. But if they're able to gust around you effectively with Boss's Orders and with Tornadus and stuff like that, you're going to have a bad time against the Bliss tank. So something to bear in mind. Definitely want to prioritize getting as thick of a line of the Inteleon out early against the Blissey players. The Palkia Inteleon and the Mew Genesect are scarily close. They're almost exactly 50-50 matchups on the data that I was looking at. So these are some of the top decks in the game, and it seems, you know, most important to go first, unfortunately. You obviously have to manage your bench carefully against the Palkia the entire time. Be aware of their option to use Radiant Greninja as well, and try and use Manaphy effectively if you choose to play it. And again, try and use your Big Charms to stay out of range of the Palkia one-hit KO in some instances. Also, having to play around Starmie V as a potential one-hit KO option if you commit too many energies onto the board is another thing that Arceus Inteleon players have to navigate. Mew Genesect is obviously a scary one. Your biggest defense is typically the likes of Path of the Peak, as well as Marnie and Roxanne, so you can try and opt to do this in the early and late game stages and try and disrupt that Genesect engine. Also, just the raw amount of hit points is something that you try and negotiate to stay out of range of Mew throughout the entire game, at least once they've spent a few power tablets. So be aware of cards for both of these archetypes, like Echoing Horn and the amount of gusting they have access to close out the game on your just V forms of Arceus when the 280 is out of reach for them. Some of the unfavourables, Mewtwo is a difficult one, certainly. Again, the Miltank isn't fantastic, but can buy themselves some time. It's really the Mewtwo is the issue here, where you don't really have much inherent high damage output, especially when the opponent starts throwing on things like Tool Jammer and has Cook at their disposal to potentially heal any excess damage going over 200 that the Mewtwo can heal every turn. They will slowly try to deck you out with that V-Union healing over and over again, and using those Silines to stop themselves from decking out. Stonejourner also takes a very similar role to the Mewtwo side of things, where it just has a lot of healing at its disposal. With its own Stone Gift and a few other things up its sleeve, can be a difficult one for the Arc Intel player to overcome because the natural damage output is quite low for Arc Intel. And it seems like Arceus Gyarados is having a small resurgence online as well, mostly because this build can take advantage of Jolteon Memory Capsule better than most, I would say, and that can be very disruptive for the Inteleon part of your deck. At the same time, Gyarados is a really annoying card to attack into for the Arceus player, because they can choose to Memory Capsule up their Gyarados and get one-hit KOs with their Get Angry attack on their V. So a bit of an awkward one for Arceus Intel as well. The only truly unfavourable I would suggest in the top echelons of the game right now is going to be Urshifu Inteleon. They have type coverage on you. They have easy ways of knocking out Manaphy even if you choose to play it, so they can spread on your Inteleon line as well. And you really don't have many attackers that are effective into the Urshifu, who can also use Cheryl and Power Pad to do healing in a situation where you may be unable to if they have dealt with your Dunsparce. So definitely a bad one for you overall. Here's a skeleton list then, now that we've talked about the general strategy and the matchups here. This is going to be a 51 card list, so you do have 9 slots to play with here, but this is a general shell that I would expect for an Arc Intel player, and then we're going to move on to some additional includes that we could be looking at recently. There's not too much to be said here. The item cards are mostly ball search to try and get things going. You can try and play around with the amount of incense versus level and ultra balls. Incenses are very strong when you're into Palkia and are trying to keep a low bench size and only really using your Inteleon sparingly, and you still have access to the arc parts. Obviously, Quick Ball is one of your highest counts naturally, because you want to have good outs to the V. That's an additional reason to play more Ultra Balls, whereas Level Ball is the bread and butter for the early parts of your Drizzle and Sobble engine, and Incense obviously good for the V-Star as well. So sometimes these juggle around a little bit, and you will see additional counts here and there filled out in the list, but that's really where the majority of your items lie. Scoop Up Net is to reuse Shady Dealings throughout the game. Pal Pad and Ornery Rod are to recover key pieces. Rod can be a great way to play around Echoing Horn, as well as getting back energies into your deck, so you can get additional value from Trinity Nova even into the late game, or if you've suffered some big KOs. Pal Pad can allow you to play 2 and 1 counts of supporters and reuse them as and when they're required based on the matchup that you're in, so it's a very versatile card, especially when you have deals at your disposal to instantly get access to these supporters once again. The Stadium Split is mostly part of the peak in the majority of Arc Inteleons, because you only use your Starbirth once, and typically it's on turn 2 when you use this. As soon as you evolve, you use that V-Star power, and then you're going to try and disrupt other people's V-Star powers, be it the Mirror Match, be it Palkia, be it Genesect. There's a lot of reason to play part of the peak. Even the new Radiant Charizard is a scary card that you might want to shut off, so that's always a good one for you. And Collapse Stadium is a means of bouncing opposing paths if you've not yet used that Starbirth, which is fantastic, as well as giving a little bit of extra disruption and potentially healing for the deck as well. It's not only Sharon's Care that you can use, you can also collapse away Arceus pieces if they have been damaged. If you go wide enough on your bench, you can then collapse away a Pokemon that's taken damage and no longer be a target for the opponent. So another nice play in the toolbox of the Arceus, at the same time being a little bit of extra annoyance for the Palkia specifically, because you are reducing a bench size for them and forcing a stadium bounce. The double turbos are naturally very good with Trinity Nova. The Water Energy is so you can attack with the Inteleon, and because we play Melanie as well. So straightforward overall, I would say. Onto the tech options then. Oftentimes you'll see a couple of accompanying basic Pokemon in the deck list. I've already mentioned Manaphy a couple of times. That Wave Veil is a great way to protect against Radiant Greninja, most of all, is the thing I would mention here, so that you're not just getting your Inteleon pieces picked away at by the opponents. Now, Manaphy is one of these cards that is not guaranteed in Arc Intel, because some players choose to just say that they'll limit the number of Inteleon that they'll put down, or Drizzle and Sobble, and just monitor it throughout the game, maybe start putting them down once the opponent's already used Palkia's V-Star power, but it's not necessarily something you can always control, and it can also leave you vulnerable to the opponent using Marnie and Roxanne against you. So sometimes having Manaphy is best just so that you can make sure that you have options, even if you are getting hit with a low hand size in the sort of mid-game, I would say. Dunsparce is naturally just to protect your weakness with Arceus. With this being your main attacker and your main priority being tanking, removing weakness can be a great benefit to you, so you don't get wrecked by certain archetypes that are sort of on the fringes, like I would say Regigigas would be one of those. It could also allow you to be protected against tech includes from opposing decks. For example, Galarian Zapdos isn't the most popular card in the format right now, but it's certainly effective against Arceus Inteleon. And if you want to have some coverage against that, you easily could be adding in this Dunsparce to help out that a little bit more. Right hand could be another option to Melanie, and it could obviously be effective if you are playing multiple types of energy and playing some tech attacking mons, and is also just a way that you can get an Inteleon powered up out of nowhere, because Aqua Bullet is no bad attack, obviously good against the Miltanks, but also can set up Trinity Nova as well on a future turn, so it can be a great way to skew that prize trade, and the right hand makes it even more possible for you, and cherry picking a card rather than drawing 3 random cards from the Melanie can sometimes be outweighed by this right hand, so that's another one that you can sometimes see in these Arc Intel lists. Capture Energy just gives you extra outs to getting turn 1 Arceus, because if you fail to do that, you really aren't doing much on the following turn and your tempo is very, very slow. So having additional outs to the Arceus in your energy count is very helpful, because when you have that Melanie at your disposal, you don't necessarily need to attach to an Arceus turn 1. So having that capture allows you to just throw it onto like a Sobble, for example. You get that Arceus down, it's at least established, and you can at least Starbirth the following turn. Then we have a couple aggressive options potentially. There's some damage mods in the top of your screen here with Inteleon, Zigzagoon, and Choice Belt. Oftentimes you'll see Choice Belt and Zigzagoon come as a partnership because it allows you to Starbirth very aggressively on turn 2. If you have other pieces sitting around in your hand, you can sometimes combine Shady Dealings and Starbirth to add in Belt Zigzagoon boss combos, potentially even, to get KOs on V Pokemon despite your damage output just being 180 in most instances. And quick shooting can be a way to chip away at certain Pokemon and again put them in range. It can allow you to boss's orders more effectively onto V Pokemon as you come into the later stages of the game as well. So definitely one to bear in mind. And then in the bottom right of the screen, some things that have been experimented with only a little bit, but can also be very aggressive, is adding in Cross-Switcher Echoing Horn into your deck list to, again, try and take prizes on lower hit point Pokemon, usually 2 prizes that you can try and horn back into play, and then Cross-Switcher to KO them all in one go. The reason why you want to use Cross-Switcher, of course, is because it allows you to Sharon's Care on the same turn, and you're not spending Boss, so that's also something we have seen to some success in Australia. Also, of course, you can just increase the counts of the bread and butter cards, and I will be showing off a pretty vanilla 60. Shady Dealing Inteleon is obviously one of the key cards of the deck, and prizing a one-off would feel really bad for how powerful this effect is, and having 2 copies just makes you that much more secure, and even, you know, gives you some peace of mind when you are getting hit with Roxanne, potentially in that sort of late-game situation, that you still have Ultra Balls, Incenses, and the physical Inteleon second copy in your deck list to be able to deal your way to victory. And then just making sure that you have enough basic energy in your deck. The skeleton list I showed only had 5. I think that's the lowest end I would play in my deck list, and I think you can see counts as high as like 7 water energy is relatively common in Arc Intel, so you have enough to Trinity Nova into play multiple times potentially as well, whilst you Sharon's Care loop. And a second copy of Palpad and Big Charm are also not necessarily staples, but they're becoming more and more popular in the deck list as well. Big Charm being so versatile, it can help you protect some of your lower hit point things, like your Manaphy from being pinged down by Inteleons. It can allow you to bring your Arceus V out of range of getting boss KO'd by opponents in the mirror match, as well as being very strong at keeping the Arceus out of range against a Palkia V-Star in general. So here's the Vanilla 60 then, very close to a recently successful list in the most recent Limitless event, where we just have a very straightforward attacking lineup here. Manaphy is the only 1 prize little basic that I've gone for. I think that is probably more valuable than Dunsparce going into Worlds, but I could easily see both coming into the list as well. And from there, I've really just buffed up the counts. I've gone for 4th Level Ball, 3rd Ultra Ball, 2 Capture Energy coming into the list, as well as that 6th Water Energy, to give myself lots of outs of getting Arceus developed throughout the game, and also going up to that second copy of that Palpad to give yourself a real long game situation and having that as an option for you. Then we have this Aussie-inspired list, which is much more aggressive, and it's something that we haven't seen since Perth Regionals, that did end up winning the event, ironically. But it's something that's sort of gone off the boil, and I feel like there's enough Arc Intel coming back into this format, especially for Worlds, where I expect Arc to be as popular, if not more popular, than Palkia going into day one. Having mirror techs, essentially, is what this deck list is, could be very beneficial to you. This list has the aggression of having Zigzagoon, Belt, and Inteleon all in 160 to try and allow you to target down either benched Arceus Vs or Palkia Vs from opponents, as well as turn 2 having the Zig Belt Boss combo available to you, as well as cross switchers in the list and Echoing Horn to allow you to get, again, funky with your Sharon's Care and cross switcher in the same turn. So a very aggressive approach, still having that third Incense coming into this 60 as an additional ball search and one sneaky capture energy in here, is a bit more of aggressive front. And I think this is actually potentially very valuable for Worlds, because I don't want to just win one, then lose one in a best of 3. I want to win my games quickly, and that's not very easy for a straightforward vanilla Arc Intel. Having a bit more aggression at your disposal can really end games quicker, and I think that's something that really does appeal to me going into this Worlds format where ties are the devil. Finally, going into Pokemon Go, there's one potential new card that I could foresee going into Arc Intel, and I've tested a lot with this deck. It's another aggressive approach that you can take here by having Radiant Zard at your disposal to have a much higher damage cap. And I think going back to some of those less favourable matchups, it comes down to the fact that people play around how low a damage threshold you naturally have in your deck list. Radiant Zard can come in and have big one-hit KO potential for just one attachment, or potentially a couple attachments with this Magna Basin Stadium card that has to come into the list. So having Radiant Zard really opens up the late game in a different approach to current Arc Intel, where you're not necessarily looking to disrupt the opponent by using Roxanne and Path. You're actually just using cards like Raihan and Clara to try and get your Radiant Zard swinging all in one go. Hisuian Heavy Ball comes into the list to give you access to that mana fee. You're naturally going to play double Choice Belt in here, as well as Zig and Quick Shooting Inteleon, so you have high damage potential. You can actually hit that 310 all in one go, and you have the potential to Quick Shoot and Headbutt Tantrum your way around Tool Jammer as well. And that's why you see a third copy of Scoop Up Net coming into this deck list. So again, getting a little bit aggressive, still playing a Water Energy for Aqua Bullet when you need to, still also playing one cheeky Capture. The one sort of concession we had to make with this list is that we played double base on a no path, which is potentially quite weak into Genesect Mew. So that's something that you might want to balance and bear in mind, that adding in paths would make that matchup a lot more secure. But yeah, really your supporter engine is changed up that little bit, where you have different sort of mid to late game supporters that you look towards. And of course, we've taken out the Melanie and turned it into 2 Raihans, so you have a turn 2 option to Trinity Nova from a no energy board state, as well as having the option to burst a Radiant Zard onto the scene, and getting 3 attachments all out of nowhere with a turn attachment, a Basin, and a Raihan all in one go. You can get that Combustion Blast swinging potentially multiple times in a game, where you can then, in a later stage, Clara it back and getting all into play in one go. So much more aggressive approach, and it's a very different late game to what you're used to with Arc Inteleon, so one I implore you to test out for sure. On to my closing thoughts then. The sort of main pros I see with Arc Intel is that it's a very well-established deck, and you know that you'd be going into the tournament with a very consistent, ironed-out 60, with many, many people having tried this at this point. Tons of success for the archetype in the past, and lots of good lists to sort of springboard off of and then put your own spin onto. So that's always a good thing to bear in mind. Also, you can sit down against basically every deck apart from Urshifu in the format and feel like you can win the game, which is also a very good feeling, I think, going into Worlds, where you're not really worried about this whole metagaming headache, and you're just going, well, I'm doing my thing, I'm consistent, I have win conditions against almost everything, I can make comebacks of Roxanne even when things look dire, so that's always a good thing to have in your locker. The main things that concern me for playing Arc Intel is that games can go very long, especially if you play the vanilla 60. I would be very concerned about trying to win 3 games in 50 minutes. You'd have to be scooping very aggressively when you're in losing situations to try and give yourself as much time as possible to win 2 games. So you would have to be very disciplined with Arc Intel. And I think this might be among all the decks in format, the most important to test 50 minutes with, because that's something you don't really naturally do when you're testing. It's very difficult to do online as well, of course. So playing games in person and sort of timing yourself is a big thing for me, for Arc Intel, to see if you can be disciplined enough in these matchups to actually get 3 games in if required. And the final thing to bear in mind, of course, is that everyone going to Worlds is probably an experienced player, and they will have experience coming up against Arc Intel in tournaments. And I imagine everyone playing at the World Championships will have tested their own deck against Arceus Inteleon. And even if they don't have the best matchup into them, they'll at least have a game plan against you. So there's going to be very few surprises that you can throw at the opponent outside of a few key tech cards here and there, maybe some tech attackers, or some interesting item cards at your disposal, maybe a random supporter here that they may not expect. But that's very limited, really. At the end of the day, you're pretty cookie cutter at what you're trying to achieve, and that can mean that the opponent knows exactly what to do against you, and there becomes less and less outplay potential at that stage, and just leads into more RNG. Let me know what you guys think about Arceus Inteleon for the World Championships. How well do you think it's going to do? What do you think about some of the includes I was talking about today? What's your favourite list of the 3 that I showed? Do you think Radiant Charizard is going to work with Arceus Inteleon at all or not? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.